I'm Mark Kelley, in for Diana Swain. Tonight, 100,000 people are at risk of starving to death in South Sudan. But can one reporter really capture the misery on the ground and make you care? The Investigators starts now.
Our reporter Margaret Evans is now in South Sudan and gives us a rare look inside a nation on the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe.
You can't make people care if you don't go there. I stood before a man who had his dying child in his arms. And, you know, the arms of that father were so skinny it looked like he couldn't even hold up that child.
It's another day of street protests and confrontations with police in Venezuela.
So the media is the only witness to that. That makes the media the worst enemy of the regime.
We are the Investigators. This is what we do. It's one of the biggest challenges foreign correspondents can face. How to make an audience care about a story unfolding half a world away. And yet sometimes that reporting can trigger change.
We're right in the heart of the famine zone.
This week, the CBC's Margaret Evans has been reporting on a growing disaster in South Sudan, a nation in the midst of famine.
People say without peace, you will have cyclical hunger, famine again and again and again.
A catastrophe spurred on by civil war rooted in ethnic hatred, compounded by drought and poor governance. Half of the country's 12 million people now face hunger. 100,000 are at immediate risk of death, many of them children.
They sleep when they're too hungry, she says, and I go out and find the leaves of the trees. That's how my children survive.
And yet their stories rarely make headlines in Canada. But CBC News has made a conscious decision to change that, hoping Margaret's reporting starts a conversation much like Brian Stewart did back in 1984.
It is terrifying news for the Ethiopian government, which is having a hard time dealing with famine threatening 6 million people in the north.
That was Stewart reporting on the famine in Ethiopia for CBC. His work shocked Canadians and the world, and even helped inspire the famous Live Aid concerts back in 1985.
I'd like to introduce a video made by CBC Television. The subject speaks for itself. Thank you. Good night. Please send your money in.
The images in Margaret's stories are also difficult to look at, but similar to ones we've seen over the years in places like Rwanda, Somalia, and most recently, Syria. So how can a reporter make their audience care? Take us into that refugee camp. You've been to Africa, you've reported on famine, you've reported on tragedy before, but on a personal level, how did this one hit you?
Well, it was worse than we expected, and of course, when you're dealing with children, it's always going to hit home a lot deeper. And as it turned out, in the end, some of the children we were meeting, it was really their last moments on this planet. And so, of course, that's going to impact you, and you're very conscious of needing to deal with their memory correctly, and of trying not to make those final moments for them worse. Yeah, difficult, but of course that's what we're there to do.
Yeah, and you are doing your job there. As you look around you and you see that you're surrounded by this tragedy, in that moment, what do you feel is your responsibility?
Well, I think the responsibility is, in the first instance, is just to get there. You know, you can't make people care if you don't go there. You can't make people understand, you know, on a much deeper level if you're just rewriting somebody else's wire copy. So that's the first responsibility, is to get out the door and to get there, which means, you know, having a discussion, an editorial discussion about why, how you do it. South Sudan is a difficult country for journalists to operate in. They're not particularly welcome. It's getting harder and harder to get visas there. Even aid agencies are having trouble operating there. So getting there is half the battle. And when you do, you know, it's not difficult. It's very easy for me to say to you, I stood before a man who had his dying child in his arms. And, you know, the arms of that father were so skinny it looked like he couldn't even hold up that child. The minute I say that to you, I hope, you know, it travels across the miles. And of course, the picture, as they say, speaks louder than words.
But of course, you're a journalist, you're not an advocate. You're just there doing your job and reporting the facts to the Canadian public and sending that around the world. And you're not there to ask people to do something. But I can only imagine, as you see those images, like the ones you've just described, what do you hope the reaction will be, both from the Canadian government and from the Canadian people?
Well, I think that, I mean, obviously, as journalists, our job is to help people understand and make up their own mind about how best to help a situation, whether or not to get involved, whether or not they think Canada should be involved, or people want to make individual responsibility or take individual responsibility or act. So you hope that you can kind of clear away the weeds, make people understand what the war is about, why it's still happening, what international players are doing on the stage to actually stop the war. Because when we hear famine, we tend to think about drought, you know, and sort of in the biblical way. This, of course, is a man-made famine. This is a country that is Africa's newest nation. It's just about to be 6 years old. It didn't last more than 3 years before it descended into civil war, and that is what is driving the famine, you know, on top of the difficult climatic conditions, on top of just the distance and the lack of development in the country and the lack of good governance. So by presenting that picture, hopefully you give people, you know, the tools they need to kind of impact their MPs or governments, you know, if that's what they want to do.
Well, the pictures are moving and the stories are incredible. Margaret, great work, and thank you for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
Another crisis, another challenge for journalists, this one in Venezuela. Scenes from this week's massive anti-government protests in the capital, Caracas. Demonstrators have been taking to the streets for months, denouncing the handling of an economic crisis by the leftist government of President Nicolas Maduro. A crisis deepened in part by low energy prices, leaving the country, one of the world's biggest oil producers, facing shortages of food and other necessities, and an opposition accusing Maduro of turning Venezuela into a dictatorship.
We've said it on many opportunities. This is a fight of resistance, and resistance means knowing who will break first.
Journalists covering the upheaval have themselves come under attack.
They robbed all our cameras, microphones, and we couldn't do anything about it.
Jonathan Bulancieri is a Venezuelan journalist who's based in Miami. He works for the international news channel NTN 24, one of the broadcasters that's been pushed off the air by the Venezuelan government. It's reacted by appealing to Venezuelans themselves to get the story out. Jonathan, you're a Venezuelan journalist, and yet you are in Miami now. Why were you kicked out of the country?
Hi, thanks for having us. Basically, we were kicked out of the country because we were covering live a demonstration led by Leopoldo Lopez, one of the leading figures in the opposition in Venezuela. He was framed by the government, and now he's in prison. We were the only network broadcasting what was happening there. Obviously, the government didn't want to show those images, so they pushed us out of the air and off all the platforms that were broadcasting our signal in Venezuela.
Mm-hmm. Well, how dangerous, tell us, how dangerous is it to be a journalist working in Venezuela right now?
If you see the images, the footage that's coming out from Caracas, from all around Venezuela, you'll see that policemen and soldiers from the armed forces are shooting straight to cameramen, to camera crews, to protesters. They're not basically cracking up violent demonstrators. They're shooting at people. They're running over people with their vehicles. They're setting property on fire, and they are covering some paramilitary groups that are under the protection of the government. So the media is the only witness to that. It's the only way the Venezuelan people have to get information inside the country and outside the country. That makes the media the worst enemy of the regime in this particular moment.
Well, you mentioned that you're the witness, or the media is the witness. You're still a witness despite the fact that you're in Miami. So explain to us how that works, how you're still managing to get images out of Venezuela despite the fact that you're in Miami.
Well, the reason why I'm in Miami is because I'm not allowed in the country anymore since we were kicked off the air in Venezuela. And we have a network of journalists in Caracas and the most important cities of the country that are taking pictures and are taping what's happening, and they're streaming in real time what's happening in the streets of Venezuela. We track those journalists with their mobile devices, so we know where they are and what's happening in that particular place. We verify the information, we process everything as fast as we can, and we get the information out through social media. That is basically the only way we can stream our feed and publish content inside Venezuela.
You're going to great lengths to be able to get that story out. I'm just curious to know, what are you hoping your images, your stories will be able to accomplish?
Right now, the Venezuelan regime has absolute control over the telecommunications infrastructure of the country, and they have control over all the media outlets, all the broadcast networks and radio stations. There's a few private networks that are running inside the country, and they're not allowed to run the news. So we're trying to get the message out. We're trying to basically inform the Venezuelan people and the world about what's happening, and give them an opportunity to contrast the content and the information that's being published and broadcast by the government's infrastructure, media apparatus.
It's great work that you're all doing down there. So good to talk to you as well today, Jonathan. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
A Senate committee is, for the first time, recommending a sitting member be expelled.
Scandal, sex, and the Senate. Senator Don Meredith could lose his job 2 years after an investigative report first raised questions about his behavior.
She had kept a lot of messages.
The reporter who broke the story is here next. Plus, an FBI agent with top-secret security clearance marries a senior member of ISIS, the man she was assigned to monitor. One of the 5 things we learned from investigative journalism this week. That's next. But first, podium gazing.
We are watching for a news conference out of Ottawa in just a few minutes.
Yes, the podium shot. The universal sign that someone important is going to say something important, we hope. So we want to know, is this really the best way for broadcast journalists to spend their time?
Awaiting the White House daily briefing, and this one will have a bit of a twist.
Well, we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see. The president may have some more information yet to divulge.
There's the front shot, the side shot, reporters getting ready to speak. Riveting television. Unless, of course, the shot goes down.
The German Chancellor Angela Merkel. We were hoping to show you a picture of preparations for a news conference. There we are. There is the picture.
I know what you're thinking. Boring. Let's just leave it to comedian Samantha Bee to answer that question.
So all you cable news producers in the audience, you'll want to turn your chairs that way and just stare at that podium for the rest of the show. Do not look away, no matter what else is happening.
Here are 5 things we learned this week from investigative journalists. CNN reported an FBI translator with top-secret security clearance traveled to Syria in 2014 and married a senior member of ISIS, a man she'd been assigned to investigate. Daniela Green was arrested just a few weeks later while trying to re-enter the United States. CBC News learned Canada's spy agency suspended its use of a controversial cell phone surveillance technology in January and placed the investigative tool under review. CSIS says it's used the so-called IMSI catchers in recent years with and without a warrant. The Associated Press revealed an American company hired by the Pentagon to help secure an airbase in Iraq is alleged to have allowed its employees to engage in human trafficking, alcohol smuggling, and theft. The company, Sallyport Global, says it follows the rules. CBC News learned unsecured web cameras at a Nova Scotia school have broadcast hundreds of thousands of pictures of students to the internet in recent years, including on a Russian website that displays security camera footage from around the world. The cameras were made secure this week after CBC News alerted the school. And Huffington Post Canada reported new allegations of workplace harassment against Senator Don Meredith, including accusations that Meredith repeatedly groped an employee while she worked in his Ottawa office. That story just one of many raising questions about the senator and his behavior. Questions first raised in an investigative report 2 years ago.
I think it was a complex decision. I think it's a decision that we as senators took on. We have a responsibility, and I think we executed it.
The Senate Ethics Committee recommending Don Meredith be expelled from the Red Chamber.
He made serious mistakes here. There's no question about it. Others have made serious mistakes too. But is this penalty proportionate?
Meredith is accused of having a sexual relationship with a teenage girl, an allegation that first surfaced in an investigative report by the Toronto Star's Kevin Donovan back in 2015.
Quite quickly, it became intimate. Using Viber and Skype, they communicated with each other.
He reported the relationship lasted 2 years while the senator was also a Pentecostal pastor in Toronto. Meredith denies many of the allegations, but admits to having sex with the young woman after she turned 18. The story is one of many Donovan has broken, exposing inappropriate behavior by public figures. Usually, the fallout comes swiftly, but with Senator Meredith, it's been playing out for nearly 2 years. Kevin, you're not a Parliament Hill reporter, and yet this is a story that certainly has shaken Parliament Hill for now a couple of years. How'd you get the story?
Well, my name is often associated with stories like this. I was putting gas in my car on the Queensway in Toronto in June of 2015. My phone rang, I always answer it, and it was this young woman telling me this, what at the time seemed an incredible story, that she 2 years earlier, at age 16, had begun an affair, she may have called it, a relationship of a sexual nature with Senator Don Meredith, who was also a pastor and a 48-year-old man while she was just 16.
Did you know who he was, the senator at the time?
I didn't. I'll confess I didn't, Mark. I instantly thought of Don Meredith, who's, I think, an NFL ex-football player. And while I was talking to her, then I was, as we do these days, Googling to see who he was, and then I realized that he was a senator from Toronto, a pretty low-profile one, not somebody that I knew or ever come across before.
But you realized that these allegations were explosive. Tell us, how do you verify this? Because she didn't want to go to the police because she wanted to protect her anonymity. How do you verify her allegations?
Yeah, it's so tough. I mean, I had just come off doing the Jean Ghomeshi story, and it's so tough if somebody will not come forward on the record. What I did is I instantly, the next day, went to Ottawa and interviewed her for 2 or 3 hours. I asked her to provide some identification, so I knew who she was. So I got a sense of what had brought her to Canada. She's a student from overseas. And then I said, do you have any documentary proof that would back this up? And in fact, she did. She had kept a lot of messages that they had exchanged through text or Viber or Skype. And I spent a considerable time going through those and lining up what she said with what the record showed, and to the best of my ability, it seemed like she was telling the truth.
Explosive story that comes out, and your job as an investigative journalist is not to run him out of office. Your job is to shine the light in dark corners, and you've done that with this story. But what did you expect would happen next, knowing that this was almost 2 years ago?
Yeah, I think my work took about 2 weeks before we published the story on our front page. And what happened almost immediately, because things move so fast these days in the journalistic world, is an hour later, Stephen Harper, the then Prime Minister, booted him out of the Conservative caucus. And what I thought would happen soon after that there would be a quick investigation either by the police or by the Senate ethics officer, and then he would be gone from the Senate. And here we are almost 2 years later, still waiting sometime in the next 2 weeks for the Senate to make its own ruling.
Well, it was certainly a damning story. It's not over yet. We'll continue to follow it. Kevin, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Every journalist can expect instant feedback to their work these days. Some of it good, some of it, well, brutal. This week, you're asking about comments and whether we read them. Ask Me Anything is next.
I'm Corinne Semenov, CBC Moscow Bureau producer. It's an important and exciting time to be opening up a new bureau in Russia. And since I speak fluent Russian and I lived and worked there before, I'm actually in charge of overseeing much of the bureau setup on the ground. That means finding office space, applying for visas, hiring a local cameraman, and working with a vast network of Russian officials to make it all happen. It's quite the challenge. But it's all starting to come together, and new correspondent Chris Brown and I will be heading over to Russia very soon. So please watch us on CBC Television, radio, and online.
On the show, we try to take you inside investigative journalism, talk about what we do behind the scenes, and we invite you to ask me anything about our work. And this week, Karen has a question. She asks, do you read the comments on your stories, and do they upset you? Well, short answer is, Karen, I read these comments less and less more now because they do upset me. And it's not about the content, it's really about the way they've been framed. Now, let me take you back. I've been doing this for about 25 years. And back then, people used to write their comments in a letter. They used to take the time to put pen on paper, put a stamp on it, send it in with a return address. I would always answer those letters, and I still do, by the way. But now that we're in an online era, everything has changed, and it's the tone that's really changed. If you want to write into me and talk about why you don't like my work and explain why and leave your name, we can have a constructive dialogue. But in the era now of online trolls, it's really changed that. First of all, most of these people are anonymous. Second of all, more and more of these attacks become personal. It's not about what I don't like about your work, it's what I don't like about you. And that's a big disappointment, because at their best, these comments help us improve our work. It's a win-win. If you improve your comments, we improve our content. Now, if you want to write in and say that you really do like Diana Swain hosting this show, I won't take it personally. Well, maybe just a little. Remember, if you've got a question about investigative journalism, email us, investigators@cbc.ca. I'm Mark Kelley. Diana Swain will be back next week. Till then, we are the Investigators.